So the war was over, and the United States was an independent country with a huge territory, an enormous national debt. Americans threw one wingding of a party to celebrate independence and peace and the prosperity that would naturally ensue once the royal brood of Britain was defeated. In 1 year, the nation would be plunged into a deep depression. Its debt would be even larger, and in order for states to meet their obligations, Americans were taxed at a rate 7 times higher than they would have been taxed if they had just shut up and sat down and paid their taxes to Britain. They were 5 years away from a second constitution. In 1777, as a means of creating a central government to coordinate the Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation were created. They produced a weak national government, a confederacy of sovereign republics. Each state had one vote in the Congress, the Continental Congress, and unanimous consent was necessary to pass any kind of legislation. The Congress was empowered to borrow money, regulate currency, establish a post office, regulate Indian affairs, and settle interstate disputes. But the truth of the matter is, they couldn't do any of that stuff. Again, the Articles of Confederation created a league between independent sovereign states. Each state had one vote in Congress, and unanimous consent was necessary to pass most legislation. The Congress was empowered to borrow money, regulate currency, establish a postal service, which, by the way, was the only real success under the Articles of Confederation. Benjamin Franklin established the United States Postal Service, which lives to this day, to regulate currency, regulate Indian affairs, and settle interstate disputes. But there were a number of flaws in the Confederate system, which became apparent fairly quickly. These defects were all due to the fact that Congress was given inadequate powers to govern the states. Congress was unable to levy taxes because if one state voted against the tax, then the tax bill would fail. Congress could not regulate foreign or interstate commerce because it had no national customs service or any other way to enforce interstate or international commerce. Congress could not enforce its laws. Again, there was no law enforcement wing built into the Articles of Confederation system. Finally, the Congress was only a legislative body. Only a legislative body. It had neither an executive, executives are supposed to enforce the law, or a judicial branch to try people who broke the law. As such, the Articles of Confederation were extraordinarily weak as a national central government. The critical years from 1783 to 1789 were filled with economic problems. Most of these were caused by post-war deflation and the failure of the new states to reorganize their business activities. Without the power to tax, the Continental Congress was forced to make do on the requisitions that it was supposed to receive from the states. The states frequently failed to meet their obligation, and the Congress had no means by which to force the states to meet them. The national debt increased. Now, some states, primarily in the South, were able to meet their revolutionary obligations, and their payments to Congress and to fund the debts they had gotten into during the Revolutionary War. The worst offenders in both areas were the New England states. In the area of trade, the heavy importation of foreign goods drained what little hard currency the nation had. Britain banned American shipping from West Indian ports, so the West Indian trade, which had been, along with the rum trade, the lifeblood of New England, simply vanished. There was no uniform currency in the various states, and this hindered merchants who wanted to expand their markets across state lines. Paper money was of uncertain value and often counterfeited. Each state had its own varieties of coins and paper money. Finally, the various states began to charge tariffs and customs duties on goods from other states. Another enormous problem was debt. When a country's plagued by economic uncertainty, there are always a lot of people who find themselves heavily in debt. Debtors found themselves unable to secure funds to repay loans, to pay their taxes, and to settle their mortgages. The problem became fuel for rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786. Under the leadership of a Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays, a group of farmers and mechanics staged a series of riots called Shays' Rebellion. They attempted to prevent courts from issuing judgments against debtors and to prevent the foreclosures of mortgages. Finally, troops were dispatched and the revolt was quickly ended. But the rebellion had aroused the country to the dangers of weak national government. A lot of Americans worried about the problems of the Articles in general, but they really worried about Shays' Rebellion. What if there were similar rebellions in every state? This not only threatened trade and the economic order, but it also threatened the social and legal order as well. Some of these folks had become what historians refer to as nationalists. That is, they believed that the only way to preserve the status quo and or the principles of the American Revolution from economic disaster and social chaos was to create a stronger national government. Some of these groups, who were the most nationalistic in their outlook, included members of the Continental Army Officer Corps. The state governments had treated them very poorly after the war, and they in fact had been dismissed with the blessings of the nation by the Continental Congress after the war was over. They wanted the United States to do what European nations did. Surrounded by enemies, these veteran officers believed that rather than retire the officer corps, they should retire them on half pay, as was done in Britain, so they could easily be called up for the national defense if war became a necessity. So that's the first group, the officers of the Continental Army. The second group we might call holders of the national debt. Now, Continental Congress had issued lots of bonds and other paper debt instruments during the war. After the war, the states refused to pay off the national debt until they had paid their own state debts. Some states didn't really want to pay off the national debt at all. So the only sure way that the holders of the national debt could actually see a return on their money or even get their money back was to create a national government that would honor its obligations. The third group we might call nationalists on principle. People like Alexander Hamilton were convinced that the Articles of Confederation placed too much power in the hands of the state legislatures. These bodies were too popular, too democratic. Hamilton was convinced that the survival of the new republic in the midst of great and powerful monarchies like Britain and France depended on a strong central government. In March of 1785, committees from Maryland and Virginia met at Mount Vernon to discuss navigation on the Potomac River and Chesapeake Bay. Now, the Potomac River and Chesapeake Bay essentially run between Virginia and Maryland believed that it had control over these waterways. Virginia stressed that it had control. So the two states are essentially fighting over who has control of a waterway that runs right down the middle of their state borders. It apparently never occurred to them that they could share that control. George Washington invited delegates from both Virginia and Maryland to meet at his home, Mount Vernon, in order to try to work out some kind of compromise. During the course of their discussion, they realized, probably at the prompting of Washington's private secretary, Alexander Hamilton, they realized that every state had commercial problems with every other state. They decided to invite all of the states to send representatives to a conference the next year in Maryland. So in September of 1786, the year after the Annapolis Conference, delegates from 5 states met at Mann's Tavern in Annapolis, Maryland, to discuss the problems that were occurring in the various states. These states adopted a resolution offered by Alexander Hamilton that called for a convention of all the states to meet in Philadelphia in May of 1787 to create a better constitution, or at least reform the existing constitution to act as a civil government for the United States. The Continental Congress endorsed the resolution to meet in Philadelphia with some reservations. The convention in Philadelphia, which met May through September of 1787, was attended by 55 of the most important leaders of the country. Certain of the delegates revealed themselves to be very special and able leaders, among them James Madison and George Mason of Virginia, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, William Patterson of New Jersey, and Alexander Hamilton, Washington's personal secretary, Alexander Hamilton of New York. The president of the convention was George Washington. It was perhaps fortunate that the most notable radical firebrands of the American Revolutionary era were elsewhere. Uh, Patrick Henry of Virginia was the governor of Virginia at the time. John Hancock of Boston was the governor of Massachusetts. Thomas Jefferson was in France as a diplomat, and John Adams was in England as a diplomat. These revolutionary radicals would have been much less likely to support the idea of a strong federal government. After all, the British government had been a strong central government. They would have feared the strong central government would infringe on the liberties of states and individuals. The delegates all agreed that whatever the form of the new government, it should have certain powers without which a government really isn't able to govern. They believe that it should have the power to levy taxes, to regulate interstate and international trade, to protect private property, to pay the national debt, to coin and borrow money, and finally to provide for the national defense. All of these issues, or all of these powers, everyone at the convention agreed were necessary for a government to fulfill the obligations it had to the nation and to fulfill the obligations it had to the American people. But once the delegates had decided what powers the national government should have, it began to break down over the question of how to achieve those goals. Should they change or reform the Articles of Confederation and the Continental Congress, or should they try for something new and different? The debates went on for the first few days of the convention over what their next step would be. This debate changed radically when on May the 15th, 1787, two of the delegates from Virginia arrived at the convention, James Madison and George Mason. Now, they had done their homework. They had actually planned on what they should do in terms of a new national government, and they offered a blueprint for a government that had nothing to do with the government of the old articles, a new, absolutely different kind of government. Their blueprint for government was called the Virginia Plan. The plan called for a two-house legislature with representatives in each house apportioned on the basis of population. The lower house would be elected by popular vote. The upper house would be appointed by the lower house. The plan would create an executive chosen by the national legislature, and there would be a national judiciary with a Supreme Court. The Virginia Plan was supported by the larger states because the legislatures were apportioned based on population. More populous states would have greater power in government. But it worried members of the smaller states. Now, while the plan was being discussed, one member from a smaller state, a fellow by the name of William Patterson in New Jersey, invited members from the small states to meet at midnight across the street in the Quaker Meeting House and discuss the Virginia Plan. Now, Patterson, like delegates from other small states, were worried that their needs would be ignored under this new system, and that this new government would create a tyranny of the large states over the small. When they met at the Quaker Meeting House, they spent the entire night discussing compromises, discussing reforms that would give the smaller states more power. The next day, William Paterson introduced a plan of his own, which has been called the New Jersey Plan. Delegates from the smaller states agreed with this plan and probably helped to set it up. This new plan, the New Jersey Plan as it came to be known, provided for a single legislature in which all states would have equal representation. The executive would consist of a committee chosen by the legislature, not one executive, but a group of people to execute the laws. There would be a national judiciary, but no Supreme Court. At this point, the convention became deadlocked over which plan to adopt. The larger states suggested the Virginia plan, while the smaller states supported the New Jersey plan. Ben Franklin began to worry that the summer would end without any kind of conclusive change in the government of the United States. Nearly a month of fruitless debate continued without any real conclusion. The larger states supported the Virginia plan, while the smaller states supported the New Jersey plan, and neither side was particularly willing to compromise. In fact, neither side could figure out how to compromise. Franklin, who was a delegate from Pennsylvania, decided that he needed to step in some way, that he needed to help with the process. He convinced Roger Sherman of Connecticut to introduce a compromise plan that Franklin probably suggested himself, that he believed had the best features of both. Sherman's Connecticut Compromise, also sometimes called the Great Compromise, called for an upper house with equal representation and a lower house based on population. This compromise was finally accepted. At this point, the convention closed its doors to the public and went into secret deliberations. The most important reason for the secrecy was that at this point, the delegates had essentially decided to create a new government, and that meant that they were committing treason against the Articles of Confederation. Now, many of the delegates had not been sent to create a new federal system, only to revise the old one. So the secrecy became necessary. The delegates concluded their secret discussions on September 17, 1787. Governor Morris of Pennsylvania put the document into literary form, and the new document was made public immediately thereafter. The document, as it was originally passed, was the product of intense and long-term compromise. No one was entirely pleased with all of it. As it was passed, the Constitution had very few safeguards for the rights of individual citizens. Madison and others argued first that such safeguards weren't necessary because the states had bills of rights that would protect the citizens of the states, and the federal government would rarely invade into the affairs of the people of the states. But this became a sticking point at the ratifying conventions, so to calm fears of a tyrannical federal government, Federalists promised to pass a series of amendments to protect the rights and liberties of the people. Next, the question of slavery reared its ugly head. The Northerners, where slavery had been abolished during the Revolution, wanted to abolish slavery everywhere in the United States, and they wanted a specific paragraph or amendment in the Constitution that did so. The Southerners refused to abolish slavery and said that they would simply walk out if any such attempt was made. Another question of slavery came up, and that was, will slaves be counted for the apportionment of members of the House of Representatives? The Southerners said every slave should be counted in the census. The Northerners said no slaves should be counted in the census because Southerners have always told us that slaves are property, not human beings. Ultimately, the 3/5 compromise was created that said, in the case of slaves, 3 out of every 5 will be counted for apportionment in the House of Representatives. Now, the Northern delegates weren't particularly happy with this. Southern delegates wanted more. So once again, compromise was necessary. So let's look briefly at what they came up with. First off, Congress was the most powerful body and the most representative part of Congress, the House of Representatives, held the purse strings. Thus, as in the English Constitution, the most representative body controlled the money. While the House of Representatives could be seen as representing the people of the United States, the Senate represented the states themselves. Senators were chosen not by popular vote, but by the assemblies of the various states. The Senate became a sort of House of Lords. It was expected to represent the most important citizens of each state and the interests of the states themselves, as opposed to the popular interest. The least powerful division of government was the chief executive, the president. He's the commander-in-chief of the military, but he can't declare war. He gets to make lots of appointments, but only with the advice and consent of the Senate. He can grant pardons. He gets to make a State of the Union address to Congress each year. He can veto legislation, but that veto is not final. He is subject to an override from Congress. Much of the power of the new national government is couched in Article 1, Section 10, which contains a list of things that the national government can do and the states cannot do. It represents the specific complaints of the nationalists against the state governments under the Articles. But the sword in this case cuts both ways. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution constrains the federal government only to those things specifically granted to it, enumerated, as it were, listed in the Constitution. All other powers are reserved for the states and the people. In some ways, the Constitution is interesting. Constitutions have usually been thought of as a sort of an agreement, a contract that enumerates the rights of citizens against the powers of government. But in this particular case, because the United States was essentially a country of 13 sovereign republics, there's a three-way process here. The Constitution has to guarantee the rights of the people, the rights of the states, and then finally the powers and authorities of the federal government. This created an extraordinarily interesting system that's summarized in the notion e pluribus unum, in many one. The convention delegates decided that each state would have to convene a ratifying convention to decide whether to accept the Constitution or not. In the state conventions, a movement very quickly grew up that was critical of the new Constitution. The people who were part of this movement were referred to by the Federalists, those who supported the Constitution, as the Anti-Federalists. And the Anti-Federalists liked this document, the Constitution, not at all. Now, the Federalists had the advantages here. The Federalists were organized. They had something to sell. The Anti-Federalists were disorganized, and they were essentially naysayers. The Anti-Federalists argued that political thinkers had ever recommended small republics that were close to and in touch with the people. They worried that a large national government would quickly lose touch with the people it was supposed to represent and would eventually turn into a despotism, a government remote from the people, concerned only with its own existence, its own power, and its own aggrandizement. Anti-Federalists worried that the new government's power to create a standing army and tax would end up with exactly the kind of government that they had just gotten rid of when the Revolution defeated the British. They also worried that the national government would run roughshod over the state governments. Now let's take a look at some of the most focused of the Anti-Federalists' arguments. Among the first complaints of the Anti-Federalists was the fact that the new Constitution allowed the federal government to have a standing army and also to collect taxes. Now, here's the problem. There are three of them. First off, in England, the standing army is used to enforce the tax laws. So the standing army could force the people to pay, essentially, the Anti-Federalists argued, whatever they wanted them to pay. And the people would have no choice but to comply. The Constitution gives the federal government the power to tax, and it constrains it in no way. There are no constraints on the power to tax. All the federal government has to do is pass a tax, and it immediately becomes constitutional. The second problem was representation. Anti-Federalists complained that only one branch of the federal government represented the people of the United States, that is, was directly elected by the people, and that was the House of Representatives. But Anti-Federalists asked, how can 65 people, the entire House at the time, represent the whole population of the United States? Over 3 million souls. Now, most state assemblies had fairly tight representation. Each representative represented no more than 3,000 people. But in the case of the National House of Representatives, if you have 65 people to represent the whole population of a little over 3 million, that means each representative represents 47,000 people. And the Anti-Federalists argued that nobody can represent that many different people with that many, or at least with a wide range of different opinions. Terms of office was an important question for the Anti-Federalists as well. Every state had terms of office for their representatives and elected officials of 1 year. It was believed that the longer a person served in office, the more likely that person was to be corrupted by the office, the more worth he had because you could buy him for a longer time. Every state had 1-year terms of office, but the federal system had 2-year terms of office for representatives, 6-year terms of office for senators, and 4-year terms of office for the president. Additionally, there was no constraint on how many times you could run for that office. There was no limitation to the number of terms you could serve. Every state had some kind of term limits, and it seemed to many anti-federalists that the new federal system was a recipe for corruption, a recipe for creating despotic power. Some anti-federalists complained of the lack of religious provisions. Nothing kept an atheist, or Lord forbid, even a Roman Catholic, from being president of the United States. Some anti-federalists are worried that the idea of a single capital, the Constitution didn't actually say where the national capital would be. One anti-federalist combined these two worries. He said that at some point, the Pope might become president and plant his capital in Beijing, China. All of these various complaints reflected real fears of possible abuses of power. Additionally, as we're going to see, the fact that there was no Bill of Rights in the Constitution was a stopping point for many anti-federalists and would be so important, as we'll see in a bit, that a Bill of Rights was among the first things that the House of Representatives did. They amended the Constitution to add a Bill of Rights. Now, Patrick Henry voiced another interesting fear. He asked, what kind of nation would the Constitution create, and at what price to Virginians or Rhode Islanders or New Yorkers? How much personal liberty and personal regional identity would the citizens of the states have to give up to become citizens of this new federated United States? Now, Patrick Henry also hit on another question that would become extremely important. James Madison had said in the Constitutional Convention that this new Constitution was created and rested largely on the virtue and good intentions of the American people. Many Americans had argued during the Revolution that Americans were especially virtuous, that they had Republican virtues that made it possible, said Madison, for the Constitution to work. Patrick Henry asked an interesting question. He said, show me the age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men without a consequent loss of liberty. The ratification process was hard fought in most states. Now, Delaware was quick to ratify, as was Pennsylvania. Most of the northern states quickly followed suit. When the convention met in Massachusetts, the Federalists simply did not have the votes to pass it until they promised a Bill of Rights would be quickly written after the new Congress met for the first time. And then it sailed through the Massachusetts ratifying convention. Connecticut, Massachusetts, South Carolina, and New Hampshire ratified in the first months of 1788. After that a long and savage struggle ensued in New York and Virginia before ratification. Only North Carolina and Rhode Island remained. North Carolina ratified the Constitution in 1789, and Rhode Island finally ratified it, but by popular vote instead of in a convention in the spring of 1790, by which time George Washington was already president and the Constitution was already going on. Now, an interesting question should occur to us, and that question is, did the new federal Constitution represent the will of the American people? After all, the first three words of the Constitution are, "We the people." Well, did it really represent the public will? Was it really the people who created the Constitution? And the answer to all that is no, not really, at least not by modern standards. As I said, only one state actually put the Constitution to the test of a vote. But the transition from the Articles to the new federal system went very smoothly. There were no protests. The people seemed to have accepted the new document as their blueprint for government. An indication of their acceptance was the first election under the Constitution. There were bitter election struggles over the new settlement. Anti-federalists, though, seemed to be willing to set aside their differences and see if the new government would work. The elections were a triumph for the Federalists, those who supported the Constitution. Most of the senators and congressmen elected had supported the new system, and George Washington became the first president of the United States. How could it have possibly been anyone else? With no challenge whatsoever. Since George Washington was the first president, let's talk a little bit about him. Now, lots of historians have written about Washington, and generally they portray him as somewhere between a saint and God's anointed. They say lots of things about old George that just plain aren't so. They say that he was an ardent churchgoer, which he wasn't. They say that he married Martha for love. Actually, he married her for money. The cherry tree incident didn't even really happen. Even the British liked him, though. After all, any Englishman, even an American renegade Englishman, is better than the French. The British government celebrated Washington's British-style revolution as opposed to the French Revolution and the terror that followed. The British government even raised a statue to George Washington in a small park in London. Most of Washington's contemporaries, friends, and enemies characterized him as cool in a crisis, a capable leader in war and peace, but neither particularly smart or particularly likable. He was somewhat wooden, distant, aloof. Now, at home he was different, but in public he was almost painfully solemn and stolid. But he was very popular. He was chosen both to preside over the Constitutional Convention and to be the first president because in many ways he was the manifestation in human form of the American Revolution. Without him, we don't know if the convention or the new nation would have fared as well as it did. In spite of the regional economic and philosophical disputes that grew up in his first presidency, both Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, who cordially hated each other, begged Washington to run for a second term. The first Congress of the United States was unique. It was a sort of second constitutional convention. It had two very important functions. First, it had to come up with a Bill of Rights. Secondly, it had to decide the ambiguities within the new Constitution and turn that document into a practical, workable system of government. Everything that was done in the first Congress was done for the first time, and the members of the Congress were painfully aware that their behavior would set the precedent for every Congress to follow. They spent lots of time debating stuff that might seem pretty silly to us, but were very important to them. For instance, what would be the proper form of address for government officials? The Senate debated the question of titles for nearly 3 weeks. Now, titles were very important, very meaningful in the 18th century. The United States was a lonely republic in a political world of kings, and the U.S. had a reputation for subverting government. If titles were too high and mighty, we might invite anger, bitterness, and revolution at home, and amuse European monarchs who wouldn't then take the United States very seriously. The federal titles had to be imposing enough to all local and state officials, though, and at the same time, impressive enough to gain respect on the international stage. There was a problem of precedent. Who takes precedence? A federal official or the government? And this problem of precedence was illustrated when President Washington visited Boston, and John Hancock, the governor of Massachusetts, insisted that the president make a state call on him. Washington felt that as president, the opposite should be the case. After 3 days, Hancock finally visited the president. Conveniently excusing himself for not coming sooner, he said because of his gout. Finally, the title of president became simply Mr. President. At one point in an angry debate, one senator recommended that the rather corpulent Vice President, John Adams, should have the title Your Rotundity. More important business in the first Congress was centered around economics. There was general agreement that most of the revenue would come from the taxes on trade. Tariffs on tonnage, that is, fees charged on foreign vessels to dock in American ports, were to be the most important source of revenue. A sectional division grew up almost immediately on the question of tariffs. The South wanted low tariffs. The North, where the Industrial Revolution was already taking place, the North wanted high tariffs to protect their fledgling industries from England and other foreign producers. All in all, though, between the Constitution itself, the new President of the United States and his cabinet, and the first Congress of the United States, a reasonably workable system of government emerged in Washington's first and second terms in office.